Tēnā koutou katoa, ko Chris Blora. It's my great privilege to introduce this session of Reserve Bank research. So our first presentation is going to be a tag team between Andrew Coleman and Trent Lockyer. Andrew is an advisor in the Research and Analytics team in the Economics Department. He conducts research on a wide range of macroeconomic topics relevant to the New Zealand economy, including housing, inflation, taxation and retirement policy, using a range of theoretical and empirical strategies. He was a member of the 2010 Savings Working Group, and he's previously worked at the University of Otago and the University of Michigan, where his research analysed how transport and logistics systems affected commodity prices, interest rates and exchange rates during the 19th century. And Trent is a graduate analyst in the modelling team at the Economics Department. He joined the Reserve Bank in 2021 and has spent time working in both the Financial Stability Group and the Economics Department. He's been involved in a range of work related to modelling of the neutral interest rate and evaluating the optimal level of the inflation target. And Trent holds a master's degree in economics from Victoria University of Wellington. So Andrew, can you come up and join the stage?
G'day, I'm Andrew Coleman. I'm very pleased to present this paper to you. We're really looking forward to the suggestions that you can make to help it make it better. As I was introduced, I'm one of 3 co-authors, along with Trent, who actually did most of the work on this and who's going to present the second half of the paper, and Robert Kirkby, who's a professor at Victoria University of Wellington. So what's the purpose of this paper? The first objective is somewhat self-explanatory. We develop a small open economy overlapping generations model to better understand the natural rate of interest in New Zealand. And our focus is to understand the probable size of different domestic and international drivers of the natural interest rate. Secondly, we want to use a general equilibrium framework so that we can analyse the overall importance of different adjustment mechanisms, where these mechanisms have quite complex and time-dependent feedback loops. And thirdly, we want to identify places where the everyday intuition of simple models, which is the type of intuition we typically use around the Monetary Policy Committee table, is inadequate to describe real data, so that we get some sense of what makes sense and what doesn't make sense. In terms of today's presentation, we'll focus on the work that characterises the long-run equilibrium, but we have ongoing work that examines aspects of the transition paths. Now, the long-run equilibrium offers a decomposition of the relative importance of 6 different driving factors of the natural interest rate. We estimate the long-run return to capital, or the natural interest rate, while these driving factors persist indefinitely. And we also calculate features of the corresponding natural rate economy. And this is largely, in this presentation, the level of capital that's going to be associated with any natural rate. So we'll have a natural rate and a corresponding natural rate economy, and we are looking at both. Our ongoing work calculates features of the transition paths to the long-run natural rate. We do this so that we can model capacity constraints along these transition paths, and that enables us to relate the neutral interest rate to the natural rate. And the distinction we use is Obstfeld's. The natural rate is the long-run rate of return that balances savings and investments, whereas the neutral rate is the interest rate path that enables an economy to operate at full employment without inflationary pressure. If you're interested, you can ask us about the transition path later, but we won't have enough time to go through it today. In terms of the modelling choices that we make and the questions that we wish to address, the first question is, what is the role of the world natural interest rate for the New Zealand natural rate? What are the role of demographic changes? Has the changing labour force participation of older workers been important in determining the natural rate? what is the role of government debt, taxes, and pension schemes? And then, what is the role of labour productivity and investment? These questions motivate our modelling. We need a small open economy model with international capital flows so that we can look at the world natural rate on New Zealand. We need an overlapping generations model so that we can convert demographics into savings. And we need a general equilibrium model so that we can simultaneously determine investment, savings, and interest rates. So what are our key findings? To anticipate, we find the most important factors driving the natural rate in New Zealand over recent decades are labour productivity growth, population growth, and the world natural rate. And the other six, or the other three drivers we look at, are quantitatively unimportant. And we identify several areas where we really don't have an adequate understanding, and they include the impact of allowing a wedge between a safe government interest rate and risky capital, and also the determinants of the New Zealand premium to the world rate and the factors that dominate that. So let's have a look at the model. The model comprises of 4 different sectors. The first one is households. Their major role is to generate a domestic supply of savings, and this is what we determine using our overlapping generations model. Then we have a production sector and a government sector. The production sector generates a demand for capital, and the government sector, which through its taxes and its payments also may generate a demand for capital if it has a deficit. And together these two provide the domestic demand for capital. Since the supply and the demand of capital domestically will not be the same, we have an imbalance, and the imbalance is supplied from the foreign economy. Conceptually, the natural rate is the marginal return to productive capital. In our modelling at this stage, we equate this to the government interest rate. Now, this raises several issues that we'll discuss later. Our modelling approach is based on an earlier Canadian model by Kunchel and Naveed, and we modify that to some extent, partly because we use quite different solution techniques. So let's start with the households. There are 16 cohorts of households. These represent in 5-year groups, ages 20 to 100. The demographic profile of the country is determined both by birth rates and survival rates. The birth rate of the first cohort is going to capture net migration, which, as we'll show, is quite important in New Zealand. And we vary the birth rates and the survival rates to see how these 2 factors affect the natural rate. So they're our first 2 drivers. Working age households have an inelastic supply, but we exogenously vary the labour supply of older households. That's people older than me, 65 and up to 80. We vary this and we then see how changes in labour force participation amongst this group affect savings and then affect the natural rate. We allow for heterogeneous household types, although in the main model that we're using at the moment, we only allow 2 types. The first is sort of the broad middle class, and they're parameterised on the earnings profile of the bottom 80% of the income distribution. The second is the higher income households who are parameterised off the top 20%. We use an optimal savings framework. We assume that consumers or households are forward-looking. They smooth their behaviour subject to borrowing constraints. When they are making their decisions, they anticipate a government pension, and they also anticipate the receipt of a bequest in middle age, and they anticipate leaving a bequest at the end of life according to some utility function. we realise that the life cycle model is not a completely realistic description of savings, but we've maintained this assumption for two reasons. The first is that a life cycle model with quite constraining borrowing constraints at young households much better replicates behaviour than one without. And secondly, it's part of our mental model that we use in the bank, is that people have a life cycle model, and we want to impose this and then see how well it does. In terms of the second sector, we have a representative firm with a Cobb-Douglas production function over capital and labour. We have perfectly competitive markets. There's labour augmenting technological progress, and that's the labour productivity growth rate. And we vary this exogenously in line with the New Zealand data. So this is our fourth driver, the labour productivity growth rate. As this varies, the capital stock adjusts, and so we have a demand for capital, and wages adjust to changes in technology, and that feeds back through into the savings. The government raises taxes via income and consumption taxes, it distributes pensions, and it has an exogenously determined debt to GDP ratio. This is our fifth driver. We allow the debt to GDP target to vary in the manner that it's actually changed over the last 20 years, and we see how this affects the natural rate through the model. Other government spending is allowed to adjust endogenously to balance the budget. Lastly, the open economy. The current account represents the difference between domestic savings and investments, and the accumulated current account determines the net foreign investment position. We've had a negative current account for about 4 decades, so we have a very large net imbalance on the negative side. The net foreign position then determines the domestic interest rate premium to the world rate, and here's my one equation, that the domestic New Zealand rate is equal to the world rate plus a premium, and the premium is a function of the net foreign position. Now, this is the crucial equation because all of the domestic factors that affect domestic savings and domestic investment go through to the natural rate via their effect on the net foreign investment position and that premium in that equation. The interest rate premium is upward sloping in the external indebtedness. Okay, this is our last driver. We vary the world rate consistent with the natural rate in the rest of the world, and we see how that affects the natural rate in New Zealand. So what's the model of intuition? On the vertical axis here, we have the domestic interest rate premium. On the horizontal axis, we have the amount of foreign investment in New Zealand. The blue line is the stock of net foreign investment in New Zealand. It's upward sloping, saying that there has to be a premium paid as you get more and more investment by foreigners in New Zealand. The red downward sloping line is the New Zealand domestic capital stock savings imbalance. It's downward sloping because as the interest rate premium falls, there's less incentive to save and there's greater investment, and so you get greater demand for foreign capital. Most of the model involves a change in the pink line. Okay? If there's a change in savings, if this increases savings, it means we need less foreign capital. That will lead to a smaller premium. We parameterize the model to match the New Zealand economy between 2000 and 2005. In each case, to solve the model, we look up the data and we see what is the value of each of our 6 drivers this quarter. We then solve the model for that quarter, and the next quarter we do the same, except using the next value under the assumption that this will last persistently. This is a picture of our 6 drivers. 3 which are worth noting is the population growth, again, reflects migration largely in New Zealand. And for our labour force participation, we have 2 separate drivers, the labour force participation rate of 65 to 70-year-olds and 70 to 80-year-olds, and we have a whole collection of survival rates, which depending on age. The model's solved using the VFI toolkit by Kirkby, by Robert, our co-author. It's a MATLAB toolbox. It's designed to easily solve value functions by doing a grid search. This allows a wide range of functional forms and is surprisingly quick. Now, I could tell you with great joy how wonderful this is, even though I have no financial response from getting this. It is a marvelous way because you don't, a marvelous tool because you don't actually have to think very much at all about the functional forms you're using. But you're going to have to ask me afterwards about this because it's Trent's turn to show you the results.
Thanks, Andrew. Hello, I'll now discuss the key results from our work so far. So on this slide, we'll plot the equilibrium interest rate. So when we solve the model each quarter over the paths for our 6 drivers, we get an equilibrium interest rate that's associated with them. And that's represented by the pink line here. This is the model's estimated natural rate for New Zealand plotted relative to the year 2000. If we also plot the world natural rate in blue, according to the Holston, Laubach and Williams estimate, we're using the US rate as a proxy for the world natural rate. We observe some periods of co-movement, such as in 2008, and some periods of divergence, such as in 2014. And this hints at one of our key findings that we'll now discuss, that while the world natural rate influences New Zealand's natural rate, we also find a significant role for domestic factors. So what factors determine the natural rate of interest in New Zealand over our analysis period? We decompose the drivers of the natural rate by comparing the path where all 6 drivers are changing each quarter, so that's the path we just saw on the last slide, to counterfactual paths where only one driver is changing at a time. And we plot that here. So the black line is the same as the line we just saw on the last chart. And then the stacked bars represent the contributions of each of the 6 drivers we consider to changes in the natural rate of interest. And we identify 3 key drivers over our analysis period. Productivity growth in pink, population growth in blue, and the world natural rate in purple. The other drivers, namely government debt levels, old age labour force participation, and survival rates seem quantitatively unimportant over at the period that we analyse. And so something like government debt levels in New Zealand haven't varied to large extents over our analysis period, and most of the increase in survival rates that we've seen occurred over maybe the later half of the 20th century, but that's not in our analysis period. So the increase in survival rates has been slower since 2000, which is when we start looking at things. So we're now going to talk through the 3 most important drivers in a bit more detail and the adjustment mechanisms that are associated with each of them. So firstly, labour productivity growth. On the top left-hand side chart, we plot the data on labour productivity growth in New Zealand. So this is the same as the chart we saw a couple slides ago. And on the bottom left-hand side, we plot the contribution of labour productivity growth changes to changes in the natural rate of interest. And the contribution of all of the other drivers are just shown in grey here. And we see that declining labour productivity growth has put material downward pressure on the natural rate since 2008. So why is this? In the model, lower labour productivity growth means that households anticipate lower future income growth, and subsequently they increase their savings today to smooth consumption. We can consider the impact on the natural economy, which we characterise by the level of the capital stock and net foreign position, in the bottom chart here. So we see the capital stock in black and the net foreign position in brown. So if we observe the post-GFC period, we see a decline in labour productivity growth of about 2%. And the equilibrium stock of domestic savings increases because households are anticipating lower future income growth. And this means that the net foreign position becomes less negative. So we see it increasing on that chart by about 15%. And the smaller net foreign position means that the natural rate declines because of the smaller interest rate premium on the world rate. We now turn to consider the population growth driver in a bit more detail. So again, we plot the data on population growth in New Zealand in the top chart there. And we note that over most of our analysis period, population growth rate has been above our calibration level indicated by the horizontal line. And consequently, we observed that the population growth rate has put moderate upward pressure on the natural rate between 2004 and 2020. So what are the key mechanisms here? Importantly, a change in population growth, growth of kind of the young households in our model, mean that there's relatively more young households compared to middle-aged and older households. And the crucial part is that these young households have quite different savings behaviour to that of middle-aged and older households. So an increase in population growth means there's more younger households who save relatively less. And this means that the equilibrium stock of savings is relatively lower. With relatively less savings, we see the net foreign position in equilibrium becoming more negative. This means that the premium component is increasing, and subsequently there's moderate upward pressure on the domestic natural rate. We now turn to the third driver that we'll discuss, which is the world natural rate of interest. The decline in the world natural rate has been the subject of much discussion over recent decades, and we use the US natural rate as a proxy for the world rate. And we see that, according to the Holston, Larbuck and Williams measure, this decline following the 2008 global financial crisis was of the magnitude of about 1.5%. And we see that the lower world natural rate has put moderate downward pressure on New Zealand's natural rates since then, of about 0.5%. If we observe the changes in the natural economy over this period, we see that unlike a change in the domestic drivers where the capital stock and net foreign position move in the same direction, the capital stock and net foreign position are moving in opposite directions here. So what are the key adjustment mechanisms? If we return to the previous equation, we see that the world natural rate is in purple there is equal to, plus a premium, and green is equal to the domestic natural rate. And following a change in the world natural rate, initially, this means that the domestic natural rate is lower with no change in the premium, but this means that households save less, which puts upward pressure on the premium. And so a change in the world natural rate leads to an offsetting change in the interest rate premium. And we can see this in a bit more detail if we consider the case of 2008. So we see that about a 1.5% decline in the world natural rate. We see about 0.5% decline in New Zealand's natural rate because of that driver, and the difference being this increase in the premium of about 1%. And this is a pass-through of about 0.3, and we discussed whether the sensitivity makes sense a bit later in the presentation. So we now move from discussing the three most important drivers that we find to discussing some open questions, areas where we lack understanding, or areas where the models identified there are some discrepancies between the model outcomes and the real-world data. So the first open question we discuss is the return to capital. So this chart just repeats the one that we saw earlier, plotting the New Zealand and world natural rates relative to the year 2000. If we now plot this chart in levels, we see that the model is producing a large premium. So the level of New Zealand's natural rate in the model is quite high. And if you recall, we use a Cobb-Douglas production function, and we're saying that the natural rate is equal to the marginal return to capital, which is equal to the government interest rate. And if we do this, and we also match the data on New Zealand's capital to GDP ratio and the Cobb-Douglas elasticity of output with respect to capital, that's alpha in your standard Cobb-Douglas production function. This means that the model produces this relatively high level compared to what you might expect given estimates of New Zealand's neutral interest rate, which is related to the natural rate. And so this really emphasises the need in the model to allow for a wedge between the return to risky capital and the return to safe government assets in order to get realistic level estimates of the natural rate in New Zealand. And most evidence suggests that government interest rates have declined much faster than the return to risky capital in recent decades. And the impact of introducing this wedge is something we're exploring in ongoing work. The second area of the model which deserves further discussion is the international premium. So this chart plots the sensitivity of the domestic interest rate to the world interest rate in the model. As we mentioned before, the sensitivity is about 0.3. If we now plot the quarterly change in the New Zealand 10-year bond rate against the quarterly change in the US 10-year government bond rate, this slope is much closer to 1. So they have quite different slopes here. However, a simple comparison of the slopes could be misleading for several reasons, which we'll discuss. So Firstly, there could be similar fluctuations in underlying trends in the two economies, which are driving the 10-year rates in the same way. There could also be similar changes in safe asset premiums in both economies. And both of these factors would mean that the sensitivity we observe in the data, in the quarterly change data, is much stronger than the pure sensitivity of domestic interest rates to world interest rates. And then finally, in the model we're looking at a long-run equilibrium, and we're capturing, so following a change in a driver such as the world natural rate, we're capturing all of the offsetting changes in something like the capital stock and the net foreign position, and these things are slow moving, they occur over a long period of time. And so the quarterly data, just comparing the quarterly changes, is not going to capture those relationships. However, we're unsure of what a realistic pass-through looks like. Do these three explanations fully account for the difference in slopes we observe here? And there's very few estimates of what a realistic pass-through from the world interest rate to the world natural rate to New Zealand's natural rate is. Dr. Wong's presentation yesterday was the first of such estimates that we've found. So there's also little evidence on whether the premium mainly depends on the net foreign position as we specify it, or other factors such as, say, the debt servicing costs on the net foreign position. So a better understanding of this area would help us to better specify the model and may improve its performance. And this is something we consider important for future work. So to conclude, the most important factors we find to drive New Zealand's natural rate of interest over our analysis period, accounting for feedback loops in a general equilibrium setting, the domestic labour productivity growth, population growth, and the world natural rate. And the other three drivers we consider are quantitatively unimportant over our analysis period. And these results suggest the most likely causes of a reversal in the decline in the New Zealand natural rate would be an increase in labour productivity in New Zealand or an increase in the world natural rate. And we identify several areas where we think further understanding would be really valuable to this work, notably the impact of allowing for a wedge between the return to safe government assets and risky private capital. And secondly, the determinants of the New Zealand interest rate premium relative to world rates. And these are both things we're thinking about in ongoing work where we're solving for transition paths to the long run equilibrium to allow us to consider what the impact of these drivers are in the short run, as well as this long run setting which we've discussed here. Because all of these adjustment mechanisms which we've talked about take a long time to pass through the economy, and the different drivers might have varying speeds of pass through. So this is something we're looking to look at in ongoing work. But yeah, thank you for your attention, and looking forward to hearing any questions you have.
Thank you very much, Andrew and Trent. So I'll take questions one at a time, but I'll load up a few questions. So who would like to have first question? So Catherine.
Thanks. I'm pleased that we're having a paper on whatever we want to call it, R-star, neutral rate, natural rate, terminal rate, whatever. It's a very important issue to be considering. It's within sight, and therefore we can't not discuss it anymore. And this is an interesting approach to evaluating it for New Zealand. The one point is, I may have stepped out where you discussed this, but when the whole of it is, the vast bulk is being driven by labor productivity growth, something that we actually don't think we know a whole lot about. Looking under the hood of that should be task one, I guess. The second point is the wedge between the return to safe and the risky capital. I have a postdoc who works with me at Alliance Manchester Business School on the issues of business investment. And it is very clear that a model that proxies the cost of capital with the safe government asset has no traction anymore. And there are lots of different, you can look at business literature, you can look at financial literature, you can look at the management literature, and one of the places that we look for to figure out more about that wedge is that there's a data set that has been put together by Gormson and Huber. They are professors at University of Chicago that does earnings calls, that does some textual analysis of earnings calls of U.S. multinationals and decomposes those into the location where the U.S. multinationals facilities might be located. At least there should be some of them here in New Zealand. There are a bunch of them in the UK as well. And so that is a useful data set to get a handle on both the size and the degree of time varying of the wedge.
Thanks very much. Yeah, just on the first point you made. Yeah, I think that's one of the benefits of a model such as this. If it raises things like the labour productivity growth rate is important for things like the natural rate, which we care about, then subsequently we should look more into understanding labour. That gives reason for why we'd want to understand what labour productivity growth looks like. And yeah, thanks for your comments.
So got James and then David.
Hi, James Graham at University of Sydney. Nice paper. I have one clarification question and one bigger question. So the first one was, Andrew, you said that you weren't showing transition paths and then everything you showed us was dynamic stuff over time. Were you showing us like repeated steady state equilibria? And along with that, you said something about this is a 5-year model, but then it's done at a quarterly frequency. So just a clarification on that would be useful. And then on housing, so housing's not here. You have somewhere in the model, you will have calibrated the debt to GDP or capital to GDP ratio. Do you take housing out of that before you calculate it? Because that might be partly why you're getting such large interest rate premiums, because of course like a lot of capital is allocated to housing, not business capital, and that's going to pull down the marginal productivity of capital. So something on that would be useful.
Yeah, so just on your first point, so the model period is 5 years, correct, but we're solving for the steady state, the balanced growth path at each quarter. So essentially we're making the assumption that the value of the 6 drivers at this quarter persist indefinitely. What's the long run equilibrium that we're converging towards each quarter? But obviously that's a strong assumption and something which we think transition paths are a much better answer to the question, but it's kind of ongoing work. And on your second point on the role of housing, so that is something we've considered, and we haven't taken housing out of the capital GDP ratio, which we've used in the calibration, but it's something which we consider as important for thinking about things like this. So possibly introducing more permanent types, so you can kind of capture different states of housing, or we're thinking about it in the model, but it's not something we've done anything with yet. Yep.
Hey guys, David Hargraves. It's been great watching you do this a little bit on level 4 at lunchtime. So a couple of thoughts. You're not modelling the world rate at all, and I wonder if you could consider a global productivity shock and global survival rates affecting the world rate. I think the interesting thing about thinking about doing that is you could then relate the processes for global productivity growth to New Zealand productivity. So I guess it's kind of like a VAR where you have global shocks affecting New Zealand labour productivity, but there'd also be idiosyncratic New Zealand labour productivity shocks, and the impact might be different.
Yeah, I mean, that would be a very interesting extension, but quite a complex one to pull off. I think the current model, we capture all of those things through changes in the one world natural rate. It's kind of a catch-all for all changes in these domestic drivers in, say, the US or the world more broadly. An interesting, but I'd say challenging extension to do. Yeah, already the model is quite complex to solve for some of these things. So, yeah.
And a question from Arthur here.
Thanks, guys. It's a really lovely paper. Really, really nice. My question is about the population growth side. I think Samuelson's overlapping generation model from, 1959 or something, suggested that population growth was the determinant of the natural rate of interest, the sole determinant. You're finding other ones as well. So 2 questions. One is, why are you finding something different to what he found? And presumably your model's a lot more complex than what Samuelson had. Secondly, you're conflating the birth rate and the migration rate. But clearly the migration rate is endogenous. So I wonder whether you should be concentrating on the birth rate, which is what Samuelson concentrated on, as the driver of population growth, and leaving migration somehow to be endogenous in your model.
So one response to the first question is that Samuelson really has a closed economy model, and the world population growth is what would be determining the US or the world natural rate growth. And we're taking that as exogenous and then looking at what the local drivers, if they have any additional effect on that. And so our argument is actually they do have an additional effect by affecting local savings and through that the net foreign asset position. So that would be one answer, is that yes, the world is more complicated than just population drives it. On the second one, this was quite a complicated modelling decision. So we have birth rates and we have survival rates. And obviously we have migration, which we could have put into both net immigration and outward migration. We decided that we didn't know enough about the drivers of outward migration to make that endogenous. With respect to the net immigration, we could have allocated it to different age groups, but that leads to differences in the calibration that we found difficult to reconcile. And so this was in some sense a compromise which said, we'll put all of the migration into the initial group and then just let it disseminate over a long period of time through a set of survival rates, rather than, and hope that the equilibrium would lead to some sort of equilibrium distribution of ages, which leads to a equilibrium distribution of savings, which then generates our results. Along the transition paths, we are starting to do this in a different way and match the actual migration flows more to the specifics of the demographics. Trent may have more to say here.
No, I was just going to add that it's something that we're improving in the next iteration of the model.
Now, we might have time for one or two more questions. So down the back.
Just a suggestion on thinking about this question about trying to work out what the pass-through from foreign to domestic is. I think you could probably, if you have access to the consensus economics long-run forecasts, you could back out an estimate of, the 5 to 10-year average prediction about real interest rates from nominal interest rates and inflation. If you do that for both the US and New Zealand, you could look at the correlations in those movements. That would abstract from kind of annoying things like term premia that might be relevant or clouding some of the pass-through in that.
Yeah, that's an interesting suggestion. Thank you.
Yes, so one final question here.
I had a question about your savings and investment in the model. So the one thing we know about New Zealand is the very strong negative correlation between private savings and government savings. But your government savings are exogenous, I assume. Your government debt variable is exogenous. So I'm just wondering, is it private savings that you're actually modelling here as the national private savings? But if not, I presume there's no reason to get that negative correlation coming out of your model, or is that not right?
So the savings is private savings, and it's in fact private household savings, so there's no direct investment or business savings. The government has a debt level target to which its aim, and the domestic savings is not entirely independent of that, because that will affect interest rates, and that will affect savings. I suspect that a lot of the negative correlation between government and private savings in New Zealand is a short-run timing thing to some extent, and that's not going to be here at all in an equilibrium. So, for instance, oftentimes, if the government collects taxes early, then the private sector will offset that. We have this in GST, for instance. In New Zealand, you pay GST to the government when you build a new house. That reduces the government's savings, but you borrow it yourself to pay it. And so there's an offsetting private sector savings from the public sector savings in that case, and I suspect in many other cases, which explains the short-run correlation, which isn't in this model at the moment. In the transition paths, it would be.
I would just say I think the correlation is probably a pretty long run in the data, but that'd be an interesting thought.
Right. Great. Thank you. So please join me in thanking Andrew. So our next presenter is James Morley, who is not a Reserve Bank staff member, but he has co-authored with a Reserve Bank staff member on this paper. So James is Professor of Macroeconomics at the University of Sydney and co-director of the Global Perspectives on Economic Policy Initiative for the Faculty of Arts and Social Sciences. He's a Fellow of the International Association for Applied Econometrics and a member of the ARC College of Experts. His research is on the empirical analysis of business cycles, stabilisation policy, and sources of persistent changes in macroeconomic and financial conditions. So please join me in welcoming James.
Great, thank you. I've actually co-authored, I guess, with at least 3 Reserve Bank economists at different times. Ben Wong in the past when he was here, as well as Ganesh Kamper. But this is a current project with Naveed Javed, who's at the Reserve Bank. And I guess, though, given that I'm not at the Reserve Bank, I definitely want to give the usual disclaimer that these views are ours and do not necessarily represent the views of the RBNZ, which might be particularly relevant because we're going to look at and discuss the effects of monetary policy shocks in New Zealand. And in particular, we're going to look at something related to, in the last session, Oystein's presentation about monetary fiscal policy interactions. Although we're going to take a very empirical lens of looking at monetary fiscal policy interactions for New Zealand, using a model that we developed based on local projections. So there's been lots of applications of local projections discussed. But in particular, we're going to have a regime switching Bayesian local projection model that we'll use to apply to the New Zealand context. So just as a bit of background or motivation in terms of monetary fiscal policy interactions, there's of course a long, rich history of more theoretical literature, going back, of course, Sargent and Wallace is a classic contribution, but many papers, Eric Leeper, John Cochrane, Francesco Bianchi, and so forth. But there's probably what I would say is a smaller but growing literature on, empirical literature on monetary fiscal interactions, in part due to the fact that I guess there was a long period where fiscal policy was less being used in a stabilizing sense, as Oystein mentioned. There are some examples, and I know Bruce has a very nice paper going back to the 1930s or the Great Depression, looking at the different effects of both fiscal shocks and monetary policy shocks in a different setting when there was variation. But it's a smaller but growing modern literature with some recent surveys coming out of the ECB where there's particular interest in these interactions, a couple of survey papers here. And one of the papers highlighted in at least the second survey there is this Kloosterman et al. Paper where they use a panel smooth transition local projections model for 10 euro area countries, and that's the most closely related to what we're going to do. In fact, the model we'll use is very similar to theirs, but not in a panel setting, just for New Zealand. And they find that expansionary policy raises output and inflation, but only when fiscal policy is also expansionary. Or conversely, they find contractionary monetary policy is only effective given contractionary fiscal policy. So I guess that at least their empirical result is saying tugging away, it could be a bit problematic for the effectiveness of monetary policy for the euro area. Just as a bit of background, because I think one of the key innovations of our paper is going to be on that local, what I'm calling a local projections model. Local projections, of course, go back to Oscar Jorda's early work on it, and have really become used a lot in the last decade or so, with the development of a lot of good narrative or high-frequency measures of policy shocks, monetary policy shocks, as well as fiscal policy shocks. But from an econometric point of view, I'll say a challenge at times with local projections, and perhaps hinted at by the Kloosterman et al. Using a panel of countries, is if you have a small sample period or looking at one country, you often find that the impulse response functions suffer from what I'm going to econometrically refer to as the wiggles. They move around a lot because they're done as individual horizon by horizon regressions, and there's nothing that really ties the estimates from one horizon to the next except just the data itself. But there's, unlike with a VAR, for example, where the estimates for the VAR tie the responses at different horizons together. This has led to different proposed solutions to dealing with this lack of smoothness, I guess you would call it, in impulse response functions. And a really recent approach that's related to what we do is a Bayesian approach by Ferreira, Miranda, Agrippino, and Rico that's forthcoming in Restat. But one issue with their approach is that they basically solve the wiggles problem by using impulse response estimates or VAR estimates to kind of regularize the local projection estimates. And they do so by estimating a VAR on a training sample to inform their priors, or you can think of it as a bit of mixing data that looks like the VAR estimates with just the basic classical local projections estimate. And that's one way to approach things, but it's not as useful in our setting of looking at New Zealand, because as I'll talk about, we don't have a long sample period to start with, and certainly not enough to have a training sample where we can do VAR estimates. The other issue, I suppose I would say, is that it begs a bit of a question of why not just do VAR estimates? There's asymptotic equivalence between local projections and VAR estimates, so if you think that the VAR is sort of the right model of the data, you should just do VAR estimates. But local projections are often supported and being used when you think there could be misspecifications or omitted variables, and especially related to expectations or foresight, that I think could be particularly important in monetary and fiscal policy interactions. So we want to use local projections because for New Zealand, we're not going to have all of these variables to capture these expectations or foresight factors, but we also want to have estimates for short samples, and we don't want to have the wiggles in our impulse response functions. So what we do is take a Bayesian approach, similar to Ferreira et al., but a different Bayesian approach. In particular, we develop a new posterior simulation algorithm for Bayesian local projections, thinking of it as a model, that's going to allow us to have very flexible and direct priors, both smoothing priors on how much impulse response functions change from one horizon to the next, so linking the estimates across horizons, possibly long-run shrinkage priors on the IRFs as well, that we might think that beyond business cycle horizons, the effects of, say, monetary policy shocks on output inflation should die out. And having these direct priors rather than using a training sample is useful given small samples. The other thing we can do with this posterior simulator is we can actually look at posteriors on any object of interest that's a function of underlying parameters. And a simple example would be if we're considering, as we do a regime switching model, are there significant differences in the impulse response functions across regimes, which say the Kloosterman et al. Panel paper, it's just classical inference. They plot the impulse response functions, but have a sort of a complicated way to try to test if the responses are different, but they can't look directly at just the differences in impulse responses across regimes. So, so what we do is we consider the dynamic effects of New Zealand monetary policy shocks using this proposed Bayesian local projection approach, and we're going to use a smooth transition regime switching model like Kloosterman et al. Did with the euro area. I should note, especially since there are people in this room that have contributed, there is a long history of looking at monetary policy shocks in the New Zealand economy, including going back more than 20 years looking at SVAR models. There are papers looking at local projections, but not Bayesian local projections, and work more recently from the RBNZ on DSG, SVAR, FAVAR models, as well as a very recent paper on functional local projections, which is a different approach to identifying monetary policy shocks. Just to summarize the main findings we have is that we find that for New Zealand, and one reason we have short sample periods is in thinking about these shocks, identified shocks, we find Romer and Romer type shocks developed at the RBNZ are more informative than high frequency surprise measures also developed at the RBNZ. At least for New Zealand. So it could be different in different countries, but empirically we're finding that these seem more informative in terms of exogenous variation in monetary policy and what their effects are on inflation and output. In terms of nonlinearities, there is evidence for sign asymmetry in terms of expansionary versus contractionary shocks, similar to long literature in the US. So we heard a lot of the literature focuses on the US, but a particularly influential and an early example of a local projection analysis for the US was Tenreo and Thwaites, where they found very much there's this asymmetry depending on whether it's expansionary or contractionary shock. So to do with the sort of Keynes's pushing on a string hypothesis for monetary policy. But we find also that fiscal conditions matter in determining the effects of expansionary versus contractionary monetary policy shocks. The results aren't exactly the same as what Kloosterman and et al. Found for the euro area, but they're the same in the sense that, that we don't want to just think about sign asymmetry for monetary policy shocks, but to understand that sign asymmetry, we also have to think about the fiscal context. And just in sort of one simple summarization of the result of not pulling apart but working together, it appears from our results that a disinflation, so a contractionary monetary policy shock, is going to be more successful given a fiscal consolidation regime. I won't go into details about local projections, but I'm going to have at least one equation. I'll have two equations. But a local projection is just a linear regression where you think of your outcome variable, it could be output or inflation at horizon H, is regressed on today's policy shock with a bunch of controls, and of course then you have the residuals. So we're really interested in what that response is to the policy shock at horizon H. That's our impulse response parameter. And one issue is because this is long horizon regressions, if H is greater than 0, there's going to be serial correlation in those residuals with some sort of MAH structure. But something that we're able to do, and this is thinking about local projections as a system of these regression equations as a model, is we're able to control for that serial correlation in our Bayesian setting by including the draw of the previous horizon residual to control for serial correlation. We find that that's sufficient to control for serial correlation. The smooth transition regime switching model, it's just this, you can write it as a linear regression, so it's the same as what we had before, but we're allowing that impulse response function to depend on the regime. In this case, we'll look at, say, fiscal regimes, or we could look at growth regimes. where the weight on the regime is a function of some transition variable, and we'll consider variables that reflect the fiscal stance. That basically the one, if debt is really high, and so it's a loose fiscal regime, then basically the effect of the policy shock will just reflect this, this one parameter in regime 0, whereas vice versa, it will be regime 1. The 3 key priors that we're going to consider with our analysis are a smoothing prior on the changes in impulse response functions. So I've already motivated that we want to get rid of as much as we can, sort of the wiggles that you would get with classical local projections. And we can also add in just directly, like is often done in a VAR framework, sign restrictions on short horizon responses. And that's going to matter. It wouldn't matter in a classical sense where you're just doing it horizon by horizon estimation, and that's sort of independent. But when we have the smoothing restriction, the sign restrictions on short horizon responses will affect the longer horizon response inferences. We also have a Minnesota-like prior and long-run effects of monetary policy shocks, similar to a recent paper by Fabio Canova and co-authors for SVARs, where they have to kind of invert the nonlinear link between impulse responses and VAR parameters, and they use this inversion to put a prior on your VAR parameters. And note that the reason that this can't just be done in local projections is because of the serial correlation problem that we actually are able to solve for. So we are able to put directly these priors on the long-run effects. And then it turns out it's important to put an informative prior, especially in the regime switching cases where you get really small samples, on the initial impact of monetary policy shocks on the cash rate, on the interest rate, to help with the normalization of the shock size. If you don't do that, classical inferences are quite volatile and show unrealistically large effects of monetary policy shocks. So we use New Zealand data from 2000 to fairly recently to the end of 2023. The key outcome variables we're interested in are the cash rate, log real GDP, and CPI inflation. And the monetary policy shocks that we look at that have been developed by researchers at the RBNZ are a Romer and Romer type shock that Bayer Magne, I hope I got it right, but Gigi, she's in the audience, has come up with a very, as we find, powerful narrative type measure using a reaction function measure of monetary policy shocks for New Zealand, and is the reason our sample period is restricted to just starting in 2000. That's when she's developed the measure from. But we also consider those more Gurkeinik, Sack, and Swanson type measures using high frequency movements around policy announcements that have also been developed by the RBNZ that's actually available for a slightly shorter sample period. For the fiscal regimes, we're going to measure the cyclical stance for net government debt or primary deficit, both measured as a percentage of GDP, and we consider Hodrick-Prescott or Beveridge-Nelson filtering. So just to give a baseline linear case and to show, sort of as a baseline, if we did the Bayesian simulation, but with flat priors, that we would get identical results to classical local projections. Here are the results for New Zealand using the Romer and Romer shock. So the first panel here is the response of the cash rate to the shock, normalized to be 1, and there's a bit of a persistence or even an increase in the cash rate, some gradualism, I suppose. And then you actually see at much longer horizons, there's what I guess Oystein referred to as a reversal aversion may not be an issue for New Zealand. It looks like there's some sort of potential reversal at the longer horizons. But we see that at medium horizons, there is the predicted effects of contractionary monetary policy shock lowers GDP and lowers inflation. And so this is with no prior, well, that's just the least squares. This is Bayesian with no priors, and the results are identical. Just to compare to the GSS type shocks, so the high frequency type shocks, we get a similar profile for the cash rate response. And there is a potentially significant response of output at a longer horizon in inflation, but you can see the estimates are a lot less precise and noisier. So one thing we're able to look at is if we think about this as instrumental variables with multiple instrument two-stage least squares regression, we can include both of those measures. We do a version of that, and what we find is that the response of the cash rate, GDP, and inflation look a lot like the response to the Romer and Romer type shock. So it's in the first stage regression seems to be a lot more informative about variation in the cash rate. So for all of the subsequent results, we're focusing on the Romer and Romer type shock. And now we introduce some the smoothing type priors to our analysis and sign restrictions that we say up to the 2-quarter horizon. We say we don't believe that there's a price puzzle or an output puzzle, so we're going to assume that contractionary shock would have up to 2 quarters a negative effect on GDP and inflation. So I sort of shade the 2-quarter horizon responses because they'll look significant, but basically by construction, by assumption. What we're interested in, though, is more the longer-term responses. And you can see that, again, we got output and inflation to decline at medium-term horizons. The magnitudes are a bit smaller than with the flat priors, but also the response of the cash rate has less of that overshooting. I would say, actually, the cash rate responses are what changed the most, so that suggests that, well, there's this sort of non-aversion to a reversal with the classical estimates. That's not so well identified in the data, so that if it's a fairly loose prior that shrinks towards 0 at a longer horizon, that actually gets less of that overshooting effect. Okay, but what about nonlinear effects? That's the key point in terms of the paper. So we consider sign asymmetry in terms of estimated effects of contractionary versus expansionary shocks. And we find there's some evidence for asymmetry, but it doesn't look at all like, at least initially, like the US pushing on a string that expansionary shocks have a lot less effect than contractionary shocks on output and inflation. Nor is it kind of a convex aggregate supply curve where you think expansionary shocks have more effect on inflation than output, or contractionary shocks have more effect on output than inflation. But we look at whether that initial evidence for sign asymmetry is actually due to just an overlap with the prevailing fiscal regime, and we find then the fiscal regimes actually seem to matter, but there's still evidence for sign asymmetry within fiscal regimes. So here's the results for sign asymmetry if we just considered sign asymmetry. And so fairly symmetric in terms of the response of the cash rate, but you see an expansionary shock seems to have a more significant effect on output and inflation than a contractionary shock. So that's the opposite of the pushing on a string. So we wonder if that's related to maybe something omitted like fiscal interactions. So the next we look at is not thinking about sign asymmetry, but just asymmetry across fiscal regimes, whether you're in a fiscal contraction or a fiscal expansion regime. And here we find that in a fiscal contraction, which is in blue, you seem to have more effects on both output and inflation. So that suggests monetary policy is more effective under fiscal consolidation. These are the fiscal regimes we identify using the debt measure rather than the deficit, and using the Beveridge-Nelson estimates of cyclical movements in that. If we did a Hodrick-Prescott, it's just a bit noisier what the regimes are. If we do deficit, it's definitely noisier. But there is a general pattern that basically The GFC is not a fiscal contraction, but a fiscal expansionary regime, and around COVID, especially early with COVID, a fiscal expansion regime. But the mid-2010s and to an extent the mid-2000s were more of a fiscal contraction regime. Okay, so this is the main results, and there's a lot going on because there's a lot of nonlinearity going on, but we have both allowing sign asymmetry and two different fiscal regimes. So I'll walk you through that in the top, in the top panel, this is a fiscal contraction regime, and we're thinking separately. In blue is a contractionary monetary policy shock and a fiscal contraction regime. Red is expansionary monetary policy shock. That actually looks to be more persistent on the OCR, but it has much less of an effect on real GDP. And in this case, similar, but in the end, we find significantly less effect in terms of compared to a contractionary monetary policy shock, which isn't that persistent, but has quite a larger effect on GDP and inflation. In an expansion regime, you again see some of this asymmetry in terms of the responses, less of a response of an expansionary shock to an expansionary shock, but also the scales here means that the responses both to expansionary and contractionary shocks are smaller than they are in the fiscal contraction regime. For time's sake, I won't be able to go through, but we have a simple counterfactual of it's not what if monetary policy didn't do anything. It has its reaction function. So monetary policy has an effect on output and inflation responding to other shocks, but simply shutting down the monetary policy shocks, we find they do have large enough estimated effects that if you were to shut down the monetary policy shocks, inflation would have been higher, this blue is the counterfactual inflation, in the 2010s and in the 20-teens, but a bit lower in recent years if you didn't have the more expansionary shocks around COVID. So just to summarize, the nonlinear results, we find that contractionary monetary policy shocks appear to be more effective than expansionary shocks. But to find that result, which is a bit more of the pushing on a string type result, it was important or necessary to consider fiscal regimes to get the correct sense of sign. And the effects on inflation appear very much to depend on fiscal regime, with more disinflation occurring under the presence of fiscal contraction. I'll just note it is similar to some other empirical studies. Again, I said it's a limited literature, but for the US, there's a study at JEDC with the time-varying parameter SFAR, where you have a longer history with the US that found monetary policy effects were less pronounced in the high debt regimes. And of course is related to the more structural approach about that Francesco Bianchi has considered in many papers, but including a more empirical paper with a Markov switching DSG model, again for the US, that finds successful disinflation requires fiscal backing. So just to conclude, our Bayesian local projection approach provides a flexible way to look at monetary fiscal interactions even given very short sample periods. We find contractionary monetary policy shocks seem to be more effective than expansionary shocks, but that depends on the fiscal regime, where expansionary fiscal regimes diminish the overall effectiveness of monetary policy. So as I'd say, the key takeaway in terms of monetary fiscal interactions is that contractionary monetary policy for New Zealand would be better able to achieve disinflation given a fiscal consolidation regime. And I'll stop there.
Great, thank you very much, James. So we have about 10 minutes or so for questions. So start over here with Paul.
So it's a great model, and it was fascinating to hear you explain how it fits together. Now, one of the powerful things you say you have is a model that doesn't need quite as much time series to get a result. And so I would be interested in how well this would perform if you stripped out the two big shocks in your time series. So if you controlled out your global financial crisis and your COVID, because, you know, that way, I mean, actually one of the things you could draw out of this is, does this result still hold for a normal time fiscal monetary policy versus when you're using them in the face of an extreme shock? And so that to me would be like one of the really powerful things you might get out of a technique like this, because you've got you know, power to explain, even though you've got over smaller time series. Because that's, to me, that's a really big question. Is like, you know, we kind of roughly know what you do in an emergency, but what do you do? How do you do this in normal time, and how does it work?
Yeah. Okay. So I should say, in terms of COVID, we do follow some of the VAR literature for the real GDP responses. We include COVID dummies, which is there's a big intercept effect. If you don't include them, it just really mitigates the estimated effects of policy shocks on output, because basically you had big variation in real GDP, and it wasn't due to monetary policy shocks, and so that's going to mitigate that. But the main thing we find if we just estimate pre-COVID is the GDP responses look quite similar, but the inflation responses are less significant. So including the COVID data, especially our post-COVID data, is important to help identify the effects of policy on New Zealand, at least given the short sample period. But a bigger issue, removing GFC, that's maybe a bit harder to do. I don't know if I would want to do that, but I think maybe what you're getting at is another nonlinearity, our state dependence you would consider is a growth regime state dependence. And we did consider a model where looking at a traditional measure of growth regimes that's often used in the fiscal literature, and the growth regimes very much pick up GFC and COVID as the low growth regimes. And there we found there wasn't significant evidence of state dependence for New Zealand, at least. So you could say that for New Zealand, at least, the normal times versus those recession times, that's not the big difference. It's more about the fiscal stance, which is correlated with those regimes, but there we actually find significant differences in the effects across the fiscal regimes.
So I have two questions on the fiscal responses. So the first one is on the contractionary versus expansionary monetary policy shock results. Do you know how actual government spending or tax revenues respond to the shock? I mean, I know that 10-year win trades, for them, the government spending response is quite key to understanding their nonlinearity results. And then second, on the, contractionary monetary policy is more effective when there's also fiscal consolidation, or the other way around. I mean, could it just be that this is because there's an additional fiscal shock that correlates with the identified monetary policy shock? So imagine there's a raise in the interest rate, and then there's fiscal consolidation. They both drive down inflation and GDP even more so. So I think also here it would be nice to see how actual government spending or tax revenues respond. Or the other way around, I mean, maybe there's also some indigeneity in terms of the Roma shocks here. So do you know whether by constructing the Roma shocks, people control for government spend, the forecast of government spending variables?
Right. Okay. It's a good question. We could look at any outcome, and that's a natural one to look at. We haven't done that yet. I've looked at the government spending response. We have, again, looked at an alternative measure of fiscal regimes that is more about the flow in terms of deficit, primary deficit measures. And there we find it's similar results, but not as significant. The regimes are a bit noisier of what's being identified as a regime. And what we haven't also done is looked at fiscal shocks. So this is really focused on monetary policy shocks. And again, it's a bit of a data limitation in terms of, for New Zealand, finding a good fiscal instrument measure is, I think, a bit more challenging for New Zealand. But I think as a baseline thing, the straightforward thing for us to do would be to look at just the response of government spending to the monetary policy shock, and we haven't done that yet, so thanks for the suggestion.
Yep. Now we've got Dan, Tim, and David.
My question is something relatively similar, basically around the idea of identifying the fiscal regime. Just interested in particular, you've basically isolated the cyclical stance of fiscal policy. Just interested if you'd considered using measures that that incorporate the structural stance of fiscal policy, and basically comparing the two. That would be quite a nice insight in terms of if you found different results, particularly against the backdrop of obviously a lot more structural pressures coming on fiscal policy, and if that changes your results. Thanks.
Yeah, I mean, I guess I'm going to put my econometrician's hat on in terms of these regime-dependent models. People sometimes do use variables that are non-stationary, but then it becomes a bit of a measure of structural change, structural breaks. It's a proxy for that. Is it really about fiscal policy? So that was, I think we wanted to look at, a stationary measure of fiscal stance for that reason, that we feel we could be more confident that it's about fiscal policy. But I guess I would take as a fair point that the effectiveness of monetary policy might not just depend on the cyclical stance. It could depend on overall fiscal policy, fiscal expansion or contraction. So our hope is at least looking at it in terms of cyclical fiscal stance is an indicator of effects of fiscal stance more generally.
Cool. Thanks. Just building on Dan's question, it relates to the fiscal measure. Using the HP filter, did the resulting fiscal series look like what it felt like? I'm particularly interested in the fact that your results seem to change quite a bit by the addition of the COVID period at the end, and that's when the HP filter is most unreliable.
Okay, so first, the main results I was showing there is with the Beveridge-Nelson filter, and which I'm going to advertise. That's joint work with Ganesh Kambra and Ben Wong that we initiated back at the Reserve Bank of New Zealand about 6 years ago. And one of the points of that filter versus the HP filter is it's much more reliable in a real-time setting. So I guess I'm less worried about that. But what I would say, the results that were sensitive to including the COVID period was more just about how precise the long or the medium-term inflation responses were. There's just better identification of the inflation response, and that was, I mean, we looked at that actually in a linear setting, so it wasn't about the fiscal regimes or not. But what I would say, I think that's a good question for us to look into more. We get comparing the HP filter versus Beveridge-Nelson filter regimes. As I say, there's some similarities, but the Hudrick-Prescott filter regimes are noisier. Do they align with what we feel it should be? Well, I live in Australia, so I would have less sense of what the right answer is for New Zealand than maybe talking to more people at the Reserve Bank and Treasury, possibly. But I would say, as a first order thing, presumably GFC and at least at the height of COVID, that the fiscal stance was pretty expansionary. That rings true, and maybe in the 2010s, the mid-2010s, it was less or more in a consolidation state. Yeah, I hope that meshes with it.
Yeah, both those had liquidity and credit components for a short period of time as well. So thinking about the third factor. But thank you.
Okay. Hi, I was interested. So you've got GSS shocks and Roman shocks. They're not quite the same thing, if I understand it right. So if we do our forecasts and we think GDP is going to be really high, we might end up surprising the market, and that's a Roman shock. Sorry, no, that's a GSS shock, but it's not a Roman shock if we're just responding to our own forecast. So just, it seems, I guess, intuitively, like it's quite interesting that you're getting better estimates of the effectiveness of monetary policy with the Roman shocks. That's probably the direction I'd expect, especially if we're a better predictor of GDP than the market. But is there anything you'd like to say about that?
Well, I mean, I treat it as an empirical question of which one seems to produce more precise estimates. And what I think at least is useful, that is this framework allows us to include multiple instruments, and it ends up being that the Romer type shocks really are dominating in terms of information. I guess that's an interpretation of why. It could be about the RBNZ forecast versus market predictions, but I don't know if I would want to make a confident statement about the RBNZ versus financial markets.
And I'll give the last question to Bob.
Thanks, James. Your work reminds me of some literature about 20-odd years ago. Blanchard and Perotti did some fiscal impulse estimates, and they were looking at state dependency of the effects of fiscal policy. So that's sort of related literature to what you're looking at. You may be able to connect back to that, but also referring to the discussion about how you're measuring the fiscal impulse, if in fact fiscal policy rather responds, those decisions rather depend on the state of the economy. It could be that the efficacy, depending on fiscal regime, is in picking up to some extent the effect of the state of the economy, the GDP or the cycle. But anyway, I thought I'd just connect back to that literature.
Yeah, no, that's a literature I've worked on in the past in the US context, and an interesting one. I think, as I said, the constraint here was finding a good fiscal instrument for New Zealand. I would also say, in terms of the monetary-fiscal interaction literature, which the empirical literature I said is small but growing, the bulk of it has been more on asymmetries given a monetary policy reaction to fiscal impulses. So with the result that's been mentioned a few times, we often think fiscal shocks are more effective under the ZLB, for example, is one asymmetry. I've also, for the US, found evidence fiscal shocks are more effective depending more on the growth stance, so the growth type cycle, if it's a more contractionary regime. So it's not like a pushing on the string for fiscal policy. But so I think those are very interesting questions, and also there's a big monetary fiscal interaction component to it, but not one that we've answered yet in terms of not having the fiscal shocks yet.
Great, thank you. And please join me in thanking James. And we have a small gift for you. Thanks a lot. Thank you. So we come now to the final presentation in this session from Karsten Chipeniuk. So Karsten is an advisor in the research and analytics team at in the economics department. He joined the Reserve Bank in 2017, and prior to this he completed his PhD from the Indiana University in the United States. His main fields of interest include heterogeneous agent macroeconomics, computational economics, and financial time series. And while at the bank, he has contributed to work on the distributional effects of monetary policy, the interaction between monetary and fiscal policies, and understanding the macroeconomic consequences of climate change. He has published in international journals, including the European Economic Review, the Journal of Macroeconomics, and Computational Economics. And prior to this, Karsten has completed a PhD in mathematics from the University of British Columbia and worked as a postdoctoral scholar at the California Institute of Technology and Indiana University. So please join me in welcoming Karsten.
All right, so I just want to start out here by acknowledging contributions by my colleagues at the bank, Elvis Ludvich and Melanie Quigg, as well as guidance by experts at the IMF who shared their model with us to do this work and helped me kind of understand how to use it. So the research question that we're looking at here, so we want to understand what the potential impacts of COVID-19 era monetary policies were on the New Zealand economy, as well as New Zealand's consolidated fiscal position. So these policies included things such as the policy rate at the effective lower bound. So the effective lower bound during COVID was 0.25%. Because private banks in New Zealand were not operationally ready for negative rates. Forward guidance, so we stated that we would not increase the policy rate for 1 year from 2020 Q1. And large-scale asset purchases totaling about 59 billion New Zealand dollars. So we're going to look at a scenario with these policies and then some counterfactuals from using potential alternative policies. So for example, what if we did not do the large-scale asset purchases, but held the policy rate at the effective lower bound? And alternatively, if we could have used negative interest rates. So I already mentioned private banks are not ready for this. If they were, then we could have entertained potentially mildly negative interest rates, like minus 0.5%. Okay, and the motivation for the work, well, we applied a mixture of policies in response to COVID-19, like many countries. Little data in New Zealand is available to empirically assess the effect of these policies. So data in New Zealand tends to be quarterly, and the LSAP period was not sufficiently long that we can really do solid empirics, I don't think, to understand these effects. And we need then a structural model to better understand likely impacts of these policies to help us prepare for instances in the future where we may have to consider using such policies. And just to give an idea of the history here, so March of 2020, the OCR was cut to 0.25%, as I mentioned. So this was relatively shortly after the virus was circulating in New Zealand. Shortly thereafter, the LSAP program was announced with a maximum of 30 billion New Zealand dollars. It was raised to 33 billion in April of 2020. In May of 2020, raised to 60 billion. To 100 billion in June of 2020. And then its discontinuation was announced in July of 2021. And shortly thereafter, in August at the MPS, our OCR track indicated an imminent hiking cycle. And in October, we did begin to raise interest rates. And then February 2022, we announced that we would unwind the LSAP program. Okay, so what do we do in this paper? We use the model of Erseg et al. 2024. It's a DSG model with a nonlinear Phillips curve and behavioral discounting. It has a conventional interest rate in it, large-scale asset purchases, as well as government consumption. We solve for a perfect foresight solution. We do not directly model several of the COVID-era policies. So the health policies are not in this model. Macroprudential policies are not in this model. Things like the COVID-19 Response and Recovery Fund, which totaled about 58.4 billion New Zealand dollars, as well as our funding for lending program, which totaled about 19 billion New Zealand dollars. So we calibrate this model to New Zealand. Just note that a similar calibration exists for Sweden. And then we apply the algorithm of Kalasa, Lassine, and Linda 2025 in the New Zealand COVID era context. So what this algorithm does is it backs out a sequence of demand shocks starting from a 2019 Q4 starting point. To mimic a deterioration in the economy and then a subsequent pickup, so into COVID, out of COVID. Now, of course, this isn't a completely ideal approach. We know that a substantial supply shock occurred coming out of COVID. That's something I would like to look more closely at in the model in the future, but for now it's purely the demand side. And despite this issue, at least we can still match the ELB period and subsequent rate hikes. And this allows for at least a useful comparison of these different tools. So then given these demand shocks that we've computed, we simulate the economy with the actual LSAP purchases as our baseline, with no LSAPs with the ELB. And then for negative interest rates, we don't do any large-scale asset purchases, but remove the effective lower bound on interest rates. What we find is that without LSAPs, we would have had worse inflation and output outcomes, similar government debt outcomes. So the model central bank losses here with LSAPs are close to reality, but they end up being offset by higher tax revenue due to increased output during the period. And without LSAPs, the policy rate needs to stay higher for longer. With the negative policy rate instead of LSAPs, we find that we would have needed, according to the endogenous monetary policy rule in the model, infeasibly large negative rate cuts, higher for longer inflation, more output volatility, lower government debt. Okay, the model here, it's a two-country New Keynesian model. I mentioned it has myopic households. They sort of shrink their expectations towards the steady state. Purpose of this is to essentially reduce the impact of forward guidance, get rid of the forward guidance puzzle. It has a nonlinear Phillips curve, segmented markets for short and long-term government bonds, a central bank which exogenously takes positions in long-term bond markets, and it issues reserves which are identical to short-term bonds in order to do this. The holdings of these assets mean revert. LSAP profits and losses that the central bank makes on these purchases and or sales in the case of quantitative tightening are remitted back to central government. And then market clearing, private holdings of short-term bonds is equal to the stock of short-term government bonds and central bank reserves. Private holdings of long-term bonds plus the central bank holdings adds up to the total stock of long-term government bonds. All right, now how do we calibrate this model to New Zealand? There are a few different things that we do. So some parameters are just based on what we can find in the data, so the size of the home country relative to the large economy, bond duration, and things like tax rates we can just find in the data. Some parameters are based on estimated models, such as the Taylor coefficient or the output weight. And then some parameters, particularly ones that are relevant for policy responses, are taken to, for example, match the RBNZ's forecasting model's response to a monetary policy shock, to kind of match estimated fiscal multipliers in New Zealand, and then also to match the non-central bank researchers for the impact of an LSAP shock on output. And this, the reason non-central bankers here is emphasized is because there's a paper out there, Fabo et al., 2021, I think, which finds that central bank estimates of the effect of LSAPs tend to be higher than those of non-central bankers. And so we want to be as pessimistic as the literature would suggest. Okay, so methodology for backing up these demand shocks. I already mentioned, I think, or no, I'm not sure I did. So we choose these demand shocks to essentially match the RBNZ policy rate forecasts or features of those forecasts, given the LSAP announcements. So the initial state where we set the economy before beginning the simulation is policy rate at about 1%, as it was in 2019 Q4. And we just put in a single shock to put the policy rate at this level. So that essentially just looks like this as a plot of the policy rate. So you see it drops down to 1%, and then, well, if we just let the model do what it does, it starts to mean revert thereafter. Then we have an initial COVID shock, which puts the policy rate at the effective lower bound for 1 year. Now the impacts of the shocks, the economic impacts, take place one period later. So what this looks like then, so we were at 1% before, and now we're dropping from 1% down to the effective lower bound of 0.25. All right, and then from there, we start the process of backing out these demand shocks. So during the ELB period, we match the duration of the effective lower bound in the RBNZ forecast during that time. When the hiking cycle starts, we choose demand shocks to essentially match the period over which rates are rising in the forecasts. And then once the hiking cycle ends, we just match the overall trajectory of interest rates in the forecast. All right, now our baseline and counterfactual simulations given these demand shocks. So the baseline, simulated policy rate, and actual LSAPs. So we feed in the shocks that we computed in the previous step. We allow the policy rate to adjust endogenously from there. We add in LSAP shocks that total up to total purchases, and then we allow them to mean revert once quantitative tightening starts. And then the first counterfactual, no LSAPs. So it's all of the above, just now we don't have the LSAP shocks. Second counterfactual, negative rates. It's all of the above without LSAPs, but also no effective lower bound on interest rates. All right, moving on to some results. So starting off, just showing, so now this is like the actual policy rate and large-scale asset purchase series. And now what I'm going to do is I'm going to subtract away the simulation results for the simulation with large-scale asset purchases, and then add back in the simulation results without the large-scale asset purchases, which will show us essentially what the data would have looked like if we did not do the large-scale asset purchases. So without those purchases, you see that the policy rate trajectory ends up being quite similar, but then towards the tail end of the series ends up having to stay a little bit higher for a little bit longer. And you don't see it in these plots because I don't have data past today. But in the simulation, the red curve continues to stay above the blue curve for quite an extended time. And then turning to negative rates, so we see that the model suggests that had we had no effective lower bound on interest rates, endogenous monetary policy would push the policy rate down to like minus 2.2%. So well below that mildly negative rates level that we could have entertained. Turning to inflation and output. So once again, the blue curve is actual. The black curve, the red curve is what we would have had without LSAPs, and then the black curve is what we would have had with negative rates instead. So we see that with no LSAPs, inflation would have fallen lower during the crisis period of COVID, and then would have been very similar during the inflationary period that followed. And then with negative rates, similar or slightly better outcomes during the crisis, but then a higher inflationary event afterwards. Output, so we see that not having LSAPs it provides worse outcomes in terms of supporting output during the crisis. Whereas having negative rates provides better outcomes. Yeah. Okay, so turning now to the long-term interest rate. So in blue, we have the data, and then in red, what the long-term rate would have been without large-scale asset purchases. Now, the model effectively here, this is a bit of a caveat that the model likes to suggest that LSAPs have more of an effect on the long run rate than what I've received from both Jing as advice that the empirical literature shows, as well as members of our Treasury suspect. Yeah, and then with negative rates, of course, it sits a little bit lower than if we did not do large-scale asset purchases. All right, the real exchange rate, meanwhile, so this, for the locals in the room, this plot's probably backwards from what you're used to. So the higher the value here, the more depreciated the exchange rate. So LSAPs, you'll see, cause a much larger depreciation of the exchange rate compared to if we didn't do LSAPs or if we used negative rates. And from a recent catch-up with the folks at the IMF, they have recent results indicating that this is the main channel through which LSAPs work in the model, is through the exchange rate. Whereas negative rates, they've told me, they find work primarily through private consumption. So this is an additional thing to think through here, is depending on which of those two channels you're most interested in using to support the economy might change what mix of policy tools you'd use. All right, turning now to the fiscal side. So compared to not having done the LSAPs, we see that the LSAPs supported tax revenue throughout the entire period here, while negative rates would have further supported tax revenue due to, again, the difference in output outcomes that you see over the simulation period. And what this results in is that, so the blue again is actual series for government debt. So this is gross debt, not net debt. And we see that without LSAPs, we would have reached pretty much the same overall level of debt, despite the central bank losses that we made on the LSAPs, again, because of output being better supported over the period. I should also mention that during the crisis period, LSAPs actually held down government debt relative to the case without LSAPs. So it's during the wind down period that the losses end up bringing these two series closer together. And then finally, negative rates we see would have ended up with better outcomes for government debt. Okay, so sort of an overview of what those charts were showing, as well as some additional tidbits. So without LSAPs, inflation output would have generally been farther from target/potential. The model implied cumulative central bank losses due to wind down are similar to what we find in the data, so the model's able to capture the real losses. The higher cumulative tax revenue during LSAPs lowered government debt, but then this was netted out due to the wind down later on down the road, with about a 0.2% difference at the end point. So then you can sort of think about okay, how much output gain did we get for what we spent relative to the case without LSAPs. This is kind of a pessimistic number that I took the largest divergence between the debt series rather than the end point. And it sort of gives me delta Y over delta money spent of about 0.9. So this is above the range of estimates for New Zealand for things like government investment, and around the middle to high end of the range, or sorry, other way around. Middle to high range for government investment, above the range for government consumption. Oh, sorry, and there's one other thing there. And yeah, this point that the policy rate would have to be a bit higher for longer without LSAPs. Essentially that the LSAP wind down gives us an additional bit of flexibility to help us meet our target. Yeah. All right, once again, a negative policy rate was not available to us during the LSAP period. But if we remove the effective lower bound in the model, endogenous monetary policy lowers the short-term rate to minus 2.2%. This was likely infeasible in reality. But the simulation suggests that inflation would have been higher for longer with negative rates. and output relative to trend would have been higher throughout. But the government debt is lower with negative rates. And as I mentioned, that the transmission mechanism is a little bit different from negative rates, that it operates more through private consumption than through the exchange rate. All right, summarizing. There's a need for a structural model to better understand the impact of COVID-era policies. So we use the model of Erseg et al. 2024. It includes monetary policy, an effective lower bound, and large-scale asset purchases. Calibrate it to New Zealand. It reasonably matches empirical evidence on policy shocks in this calibration. And then we conduct the simulations following Kalasa, Lacine, and Linda, finding that LSAPs improved inflation and output outcomes, that the purchases increased revenue and lowered debt during the crisis, and this almost entirely offset mark-to-market losses in the long run due to the wind down. And a negative rates counterfactual, mixed inflation, we have mixed inflation outcomes, but higher output and lower debt. This is a suggestion given to me by the IMF folks based on a paper they have from 2014, finding that LSAPs were likely less costly than conventional fiscal policy. All right, so I think that's me.
Thank you very much. So we probably have about 15 minutes for questions. So who would like to open the floor? So we've got Dan here.
Thanks, Karsten. Just like to, so that's a fantastic modelling lens on trying to start to pick apart the effectiveness of some of our tools around the effective lower bound. I'd really just like to sort of encourage to take this even further in terms of exploring the interactions of using multiple tools at once. There's a variety of different areas we can sort of explore there. One, for example, is in terms of the asymmetry of how tools might work together in the implementation and the exit phase of tools. So there's a variety of things to look at in terms of how tools work both together and at any point in time and also over time. So thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Dan, and absolutely, that's the plan for this going forward, is to just use this model for whatever we can think of. And certainly, again, after my most recent chat with the IMF folks, they were sort of pushing forward this idea of, how much do you want to use negative rates versus this exchange rate channel from LSAPs, that sort of thing. Yeah.
Jane?
Okay. Very interesting presentation. I like to see more central banks doing quantitative analysis about our unconventional monetary policy. And in particular, I think we share a lot of commonalities. We're small open economy. So like you mentioned, for small open economy, I think probably the most important channel is through exchange rate depreciation. Then I wonder whether, say, forward guidance would have done the same thing. I don't know how easy it is in your model. So without QE, whether or not forward guidance would have delivered very similar results. That's the number one question. Number two, I'm very fascinated by your experiment on negative interest rate. Bank of Canada has been following all the countries who have done negative interest rate. What we noticed is the transmission channel of monetary policy when rates go into negative is quite different. If you look at Professor Brunemeyer's paper about reversal rate, so all of this give us a pause about going to the negative. I'm very curious about your comments on that. Thank you.
Yeah, so I mean, that sounds to me like something that we should definitely be educating ourselves on. And I mean, it would sort of be my, I guess, prior that you would see different dynamics as you go negative, just because it essentially changes, depending on assets or liabilities that you hold, what those are doing in somewhat, it would seem, of a fundamental way. But then also, you should expect there to be non-linearities as you get towards whatever effective lower bound there is, where people are no longer willing to pay and start holding cash or something like that. But I'll have to definitely follow up with you about that reference and go and explore the evidence that's out there a little bit more. So yeah, thanks for that.
Great. Sarah?
Could have just taken it from Zheng. Thank you for the paper. It's really, really interesting, and I agree. Exploring this stuff is actually really important for the next time. Hopefully not, but the next time we have to go this way. A sort of follow-up question for Jans actually around the exchange rate and your final dot point there around LSATs being less costly than conventional fiscal policy. Is there something in this around the exchange rate and global shocks versus domestic shocks? I'm coming back to a theme from earlier on. So if it's a global shock, you get a different type of exchange rate response. And does that change your conclusions? And I'm particularly interested in that last one, because I think that that's not an obvious conclusion to people, but maybe actually it potentially changes some of your other conclusions as well.
Yeah, I think I would tend to agree with that whether you're looking at a domestic shock or a global shock will change, whether or not you want the exchange rate to be doing the work. And I guess my sort of immediate reaction, again, given sort of what I'm hearing back from the folks at the fund, that if it's a domestic shock, then that sounds to me like you want private demand to probably take the leading role. And so there you might prefer negative rates, caveat to what Jing's saying about maybe they don't work the way you think they do. And then for a global shock, you're probably more inclined to use the exchange rate channel. You look skeptical?
Can you?
Oh, can you?
Because if everything's impacted.
Yes. I would say yes. I mean, like the global shock will affect your exchange rate, but then your policy, has the power to affect it all else equal as well. You may not be able to set your exchange rate at a level you want to with the policy tools available, but you can definitely impact it in a direction that would be policy consistent, I would think.
So in a way, this runs a bit of a horse race between negative rates and LSAPs instead. And it's a slightly broader question, but there was no central bank, as I understand it, post when the COVID shock came along, that if they weren't already negative, they either went more negative or chose to go negative. So no central bank decided to go down that path of more negative. And in fact, this was the strategy. I wonder whether you had any remarks on, like, why? Like, if we look across the whole space, why is it that this is the preferred? Is there a clear reason why, or is it just a lack of understanding?
Yeah, I can't necessarily speak to what the global central banking world was or wasn't doing necessarily. So, yeah, I guess for us, right, the reason why this comparison is maybe a little bit interesting is the sense that, like, the reason we couldn't go negative was this issue that, the private banks aren't ready to do it. And, the question of, well, if they were ready, would that have been our preferred tool, at least initially? So that's where, it becomes, I think, an interesting comparison from our end. I mean, I guess maybe globally, it's sort of if no other central bank decided this was the time to go negative, it might be a similar sort of story, is that the shock was big and sudden, and they, hadn't necessarily done the work to prepare or something like that. But I'm not certain.
Arthur.
Yeah, it's a lovely paper. Thanks, Karsten. I found it fascinating. Seemed all the action is happening through the financial prices, the exchange rate, and maybe the long-term interest rate. Is there a bank lending channel in here? If you think about the financial intermediation literature, I was wondering whether there's any effect on the quantity of bank lending in this, either in your model or in the economy as a whole.
Yes, so I should preface this that I do not have an encyclopedic knowledge of the model equations, being not the person who, drove the first order conditions and typed them into Diner, but I'm fairly certain that there's no banking sector in the model, so the households are simply obtaining the bonds from the government or the open market, essentially.
Do you think in practice there was a bank lending channel? Not in your model, but do you think there was any effect on bank lending?
I mean, again, my instinct would be to say probably yes. I mean, the point was, at least in part, to bring long-run interest rates down. That should presumably push up demand for credit.
Liz?
Yeah, that was a lovely paper. It's certainly changed some of my views on LSAPs. In particular, the idea that the actual cost of LSAPs was much lower, certainly than the media was suggesting in New Zealand. The Reserve Bank got a lot of flack, and the ex-governor got a lot of flack about what the cost of LSAPs would possibly be. I mean, was this the results that you got, were they a surprise to you in any sense? That's one question. And secondly, is there anything in the literature that had suggested that LSAPs would be relatively cheap in terms, because this seems to be news, at least to me. And I wonder whether this is another example of what we heard this morning of good luck rather than good judgment. And thirdly, would you expect that this would be something that you would find in other countries if you were to do a similar sort of exercise?
Right. So, yeah, I mean, I guess, prior to sort of starting this work or first hearing about it, I wouldn't have necessarily thought about these, the fiscal side of things and output supporting tax revenue. And then now once I, sort of was made aware of it, it doesn't surprise me at all that, that would offset the losses to some degree. I didn't really have a strong prior going in about whether or not the losses would be completely offset. So it's, in that sense, nice to see that ends up being the case in the model, and at least adds to our sophistication about thinking about these tools. Okay, and of course this isn't the last word, right? We've got to keep working on this, keep thinking about it. And then, sorry, and whether there's prior work done. So, I mean, I think we initially heard about this work when the IMF visited us for an Article 4 consultation, where they presented results out of their initial papers talking about kind of this consolidated fiscal costs. And so this work is to really just, bring the New Zealand experience into it and allow us to educate ourselves about it. So their experts are hard at work on this. As I mentioned, Swedish researcher Stefan Lassin is hard at work on it. So yeah, we're in good company, I think.
Dr. Mann?
It's a very interesting exercise. And two comments. One is bringing out this issue about exchange rates again, because when there's this much dependence on the exchange rate as your transmission channel, it raises concerns in my mind as a policymaker. We too have situations where our model is delivering very significant consequences through the exchange rate channel, And then, of course, when we look at the data, there is no exchange rate channel happening in reality because of either everybody's doing the same policy at the same time or experiencing the same shock at the same time, and so you all can't compete using the exchange rate. That's the first observation, and I'm curious as to whether or not how you handle that in the context of calibration. But the second is there's a fair body of work that uses microfoundations to evaluate the extent to which given say a positive demand shock would normally be associated with monetary policy tightening, appreciation of the exchange rate. So you get two different channels through which you get downward pressure on your CPI. But in fact, the exchange rate channel is not operational in a micro foundations kind of world because firms know they don't have to pass through the appreciation because it's a positive demand shock, and so they just kind of go ahead and price into that positive demand. And you can kind of talk that story through in a couple different ways. The original paper of that was done by Kristen Forbes when she was in my position at the Bank of England, and my teams have kind of spiffed it up some more, several years later, new technologies, et cetera. They've spiffed that up more, but the underlying issues continue to remain, that you really cannot depend on the exchange rate channel to work in sort of the traditional way, either because everybody's got the same shocks and are trying to do the same thing, or because from a micro foundations channel you have firm responsiveness kind of short-circuiting what in a standard interest rate parity type of world would generate pass-through. So I guess that's my first comment, and as I say, my specific question is, how do you calibrate New Zealand when you're looking at the exchange rate? Does it match kind of with the experience in reality? The second question, though, I guess, or comment is, I also am intrigued that the net cost is tiny to the fiscal authority, and I don't know what that answer would be for the UK, so I'd be pretty interested in having this model kind of do the exercise in the UK to see what you get. But of course, from the standpoint of a real-time challenge in a media-oriented environment, people have forgotten that there was a gain, and they are very focused on the current loss. I don't know how that is treated on your consolidated fiscal environment, but people are very, very conscious of the losses right now, and telling them that there were gains before, which we have done several times, notably at Treasury Select Committee, that is not, that's water under the bridge. And if you have any kind of discounting in your kind of political and other environments, then the fact that there were gains before, but there are losses now, the losses are salient, and so it's useful to find out the conclusion, but I do wonder a little bit about discounting that sort of in the time dimension.
Yeah, okay, so just to start off with regards to calibration with respect to the exchange rate, I guess the main place where I would have been looking at the exchange rate would have been a response to a monetary policy shock in the bank's forecasting model, and just checking whether that response was fairly similar. But to be honest, if I recall correctly, that might have been the one impulse response where I was unhappy with it. So this is probably something we should go back to and look at a little bit more closely. And frankly, I should communicate this back to the contacts at the IMF that, this is the sort of feedback we're getting here, because it does sound important. On the point of, everyone's doing the same thing, so how do you use the exchange rate channel in that case? Also an excellent point. Now, that is something I can actually look at in the model to a degree, because there is the large country, and you can also put in QE shocks for them and see if, that works or not. or if the results hold. Let's see. Then there was something else. Oh yeah, and then regarding, well, yeah, as far as doing the exercise in the UK, I can give you the names of the people you can get in touch. And I mean, I went and they just emailed me their code. So.
I didn't work with Chris personally.
Okay, yeah.
You know, back in the day, so.
Yep.
I know her.
Awesome, yeah. And then as far as people being focused on current losses, I mean, one thing that you could potentially do to offset that is just don't do QT. In the model, the losses all come from QT. The other thing that you could maybe point out is that QT should, all else equal, have a disinflationary effect. That might ring more true. That's the reason you're doing QT, right? So we've got to get inflation down. That'll entail a bit of a fiscal cost.
Thank you. So I saw a number of extra hands, but we're running a little bit over time, so might have to save those questions for the afternoon tea break. So please join me in thanking Karsten.